Today's video is for perfectionist writers. Many people will say that it's impossible for perfectionists to write a novel because their standards prevent them from progressing in their writing project. They never end up finishing their story. But high standards aren't what get in the way. If you're a perfectionist, your high standards are one of the reasons that you even start writing. Your high standards aren't the reason that you stop writing or struggle to write. What really prevents perfectionists from making progress in their writing project? What really stops them from finishing is high expectations. So if you're a perfectionist and nobody so far has managed to talk you down from your high standards, even though you are struggling to finish writing your story, then know this: you don't have to lower your standards. You only need to adjust your expectations. In this video, I'm going to give you the 4 things that you should expect to happen if you're a perfectionist struggling to write a novel or a story. There's also one crucial prerequisite that you must absolutely keep in mind when you write, which if you don't, it'll be like trying to hike up a mountain through a jungle while insisting that you don't want to break into a sweat. You are giving yourself an exponentially harder time than everyone else who's not using those extra rules. But if you can get eye to eye with reality by understanding all of these things, and you can accept what it's going to take to walk the path that you've chosen, then I'm so excited to help you, one perfectionist to another. Let's go. Before we get into the 4 realistic expectations and the perfectionist prerequisite, we need to first understand exactly what we mean when we're talking about a perfectionist, and understand exactly why people try to give advice trying to fix or cure perfectionism. Because if you're a perfectionist, you've probably heard so many times that you need to overcome your perfectionism, or that you're wrong and you need to change. So we need to understand too why people say these things and claim that perfectionism needs to be overcome, before we can understand what it is exactly that they're missing and why they're mistaken about perfectionism. So where does perfectionism even come from? Why are some people perfectionistic but others are not? In the portrait of a perfectionist, there's 3 elements we can see. The first thing is that in order to be a perfectionist, someone has to first have an idea of what perfection even looks like. Without that conception, without a standard for which to hold up anything against, there's no bar to set or no goal to strive for. A key idea here is the idea of taste. Maybe you've known someone who you might say has bad taste, maybe in music or fashion or movies. And when we say bad taste, what we really mean is that this person doesn't seem to have a developed or accurate sense of what is good and what is not good. Now, you might be thinking that goodness is something that's subjective, but let me finish my point here. Taste, as we're talking about it here, isn't necessarily about a universal agreement on what is good. It's about holding your own opinion on what you personally believe is good. People with taste might gravitate to conventional or unconventional things, but what's crucial is the fact that they gravitate to certain things at all. What's important to understand in the context of what we're talking about isn't the difference between good taste and bad taste. It's the difference between having taste and not having taste. For example, some people can't tell or don't care about the difference between good food and bad food. They'll eat whatever's in front of them without dwelling on things like the balance of textures and flavors in the dish. As long as it's palatable, it meets a minimum viable requirement, and anything beyond that is basically irrelevant to them. In the same way, there are some people who can't tell the difference between good acting and bad acting. They'll watch movies and it'll all look the same. So the first element in a portrait of a perfectionist is a sense of taste, a refined sense of taste. They've read enough novels and consumed enough stories to know what works and doesn't work for them personally. And they've developed their own opinion on what they think is good and not good. For any story that they examine, they could tell you in great detail what they thought was good and what they thought was lacking. Tasteful people can dissect and analyze and appreciate what they find. And that's the second element in the portrait of a perfectionist. Perfectionists are detail-oriented people. They're able to break a story down into its tiniest constituent parts. They'll notice foreshadowing, anticipate plot twists, and they can read between the lines of dialogue to get to the subtext of character relationships and hidden motivations. These two elements, their refined sense of taste and their keen eye for detail, give them very high standards because they know exactly what it is that they're looking for, and they know that they'll be able to see it if it's there. But if these two things were all there is to say about perfectionists, it would be more accurate to call these people connoisseurs or aficionados. If we were being unkind, we might call them picky, fastidious snobs. When we talk about perfectionists, there's one more thing. The third element that characterizes them, and it's this. The high standards they have for what they enjoy, they turn those high standards on themselves. The reason they do this is because they have a deep awareness for how their own work could be scrutinized. They anticipate that others will pick apart their work, the same way they've picked at other people's work. And the picking isn't malicious. It's actually out of curiosity. It's a curious examination, but it's an examination that's necessary to find out whether the things they are looking for are there or not. And when other people examine their work, they want them to find that things are good, not that they aren't good. Perfectionists have probably had experiences somewhere where other people around them didn't understand that there's a difference between the skill of analysis and the skill of construction. Because there is a difference between proficiency in critique and proficiency in a practice. Ignorant people might be under the assumption that the only people who are qualified to give critique are people who are proficient in the skill. Or maybe you've heard when you give a criticism of something, somebody told you, oh, like you could do any better. As if that would invalidate the analysis or critique that you're giving. Because it's not the case. Critique is a separate skill from practice. Critique is a separate skill from execution. That's why for perfectionists, their work is such a high-stakes activity. Personally and socially, they are under such intense pressure to impress, because failure could mean that they'll be labeled a hypocrite or a fraud. So this is what we mean when we're talking about perfectionists. These three elements are how you pick them out of a crowd. And I'm not saying that perfectionists are better than other people, or that everybody should be perfectionistic. Everybody can make their own decision about how they want to be and what they want to do, that's fine. But I will say that it's right for there to be perfectionists in the world. Because if there weren't any people around pointing things out and saying this isn't good enough, the world would be like a ruinous garbage heap. It would be a stagnant, mediocre place. Things only get better when there are people around who believe that better is possible. So if that's the case, why do some people try to talk others out of their perfectionism? Why do they try to cure it? Well, it's because these people are trying to help you, genuinely. They don't want to stay silent because they've seen the painful problems that they believe perfectionism causes for writers. So now that we know what it means to be a perfectionist writer, let's move on and look at what kinds of problems perfectionism can cause. Remember that we said that perfectionists feel like writing is a high-stakes activity. Then one of the obvious problems is that when you're so focused on doing things perfectly, it can be really hard to even start, let alone finish writing. If you're already disappointed with the writing that you've so far managed to produce, your brain projects out onto the future and predicts that all the rest of your writing project is going to be just as disappointing and inadequate. Using hours of your life to write this inevitably disappointing story would just be a ginormous waste of time. So you don't even get started. And when you do manage to convince yourself to try, and really try as hard as you can, you are under such intense pressure from the high stakes of your high standards that every word, every sentence is carrying such a heavy burden. It makes the blank page you're face to face with seem like an intimidating wall. And other people can see this. You're so paralyzed by the fear of your failure, you waste time procrastinating. You work and rework your plans. You become so exhausted and get so burnt out that you give up. And they don't want that for you. They want you to reach your dreams and finish writing your story. So they tell you to fix and overcome your perfectionism so that it doesn't hold you back. But procrastination, fear of failure, and burnout are not problems unique to perfectionist writers. Writers who don't have these same standards of perfectionism, they run into these problems too. If you're struggling with these three things, you should watch my previous video on if you want to write, but you can't. It's about all the different causes of writer's block, and perfectionism isn't one of them. If you're running into these problems, the actual root of your problem is emotional and psychological issues that have to do with your reason for writing. the negative emotions you're avoiding and the positive emotions that you're seeking control your brain's calculation for whether or not you'll act, whether or not you'll write. So because perfectionists end up making slow progress, no progress, or very limited progress on their writing projects before they inevitably walk away from them, the people who want to encourage you, the people who believe in your work, will tell you to get rid of your perfectionism and cure it, because they think that's the cause of your problems. But what nobody wants to say is that there aren't very good educational resources for giving operationalized, explicit, step-by-step instructions for how to write a story that's up to the standards of a perfectionist. But for now, we can start getting into the 4 expectations that perfectionist writers must have if they want to write their writing project. Now, I did say that there are 4 expectations that perfectionists need to have if they want to have a robust mindset for writing. But the first thing we have to talk about is the prerequisite, which is that you must uncouple your sense of self-worth from the quality of your work. The metaphor I used earlier was that trying to do something like this is like trying to hike up a mountain through a jungle while insisting that you don't break into a sweat. You are trying to do 2 different things that you have, for some reason, unnecessarily attached to one another so that you can achieve them at the same time. You're trying to write a novel to your high standards, but you also want that experience or that outcome to give you a high sense of self-worth as a result. You've attached something that is a psychological keystone for your mental health to an external outcome that's not necessarily always exactly in your control. I mean, you need a sense of self-worth for a sense of mental stability, right? In general, it's not easy to live or keep on living if you don't even like yourself or feel like you're worth something. So why is your sense of self-worth attached to something as questionable as the quality of your work? You need to separate these 2 things. Otherwise, it's quite likely that you will suffer a great deal and experience life as a chaotic emotional roller coaster. And depending on how the wind blows, that's going to be what dictates how you feel. It's unstable, because you will inevitably write useless, ugly garbage, but that's necessary. Mechanics can't do their work if they're not willing to get their hands greasy. Surgeons can't do their work if they're afraid of blood. And sanitation workers can't do their work if they're squeamish about sewage. In the same way, writers also have to get into the viscera and mess of sentences and words. It's how things get fixed up and cleaned and fine-tuned. Your story won't be born perfect. You're going to have to put your hands on it and refine it up to your standards. So before trying to go into a writing project as a perfectionist, you absolutely have to understand that you are not your work. So if you have a stable sense of self-worth, then you're good to go. Otherwise, you probably have bigger fish to fry working on yourself. But don't take my word for it. Try it yourself if that's what you want to do. Okay, now that you know the prerequisite, let's start with expectation number 1. You will get hurt. You will feel bad. Writing is going to bring up a lot of negative emotions. Fear, disappointment, frustration, insecurity. In my previous video, I talked about how negative emotions drive writers away from writing. They are what gets in between your intention to write and the actual act of writing. Negative emotions is one of the major causes of writer's block. And people who mistakenly think that perfectionism causes writer's block don't acknowledge that negative emotion is the major comorbidity of perfectionism. And that comorbidity is what causes writer's block, not perfectionism. So if you can expect that your feelings will get hurt and that writing is something that's going to feel bad, at least some of the time, you need to be able to grapple with and sit with and process your negative emotions. I gave the speedrun crash course in my last video. There's 3 steps. You can go there and watch just that timestamp. Because if you can't face negative emotions, you probably find that you're chased away from a lot of things that you want in life. But if you're a perfectionist with a strong belief in your high standards, I have faith that you'll be able to do this. Because your perfectionism is moving you toward writing so strongly, it's driving and motivating you past the negative emotions, not blocking you. The second expectation is that you can expect to fail to meet your high standards. I'm not saying that you're going to fail all the time. I'm not saying that the failure rate is going to be 100%. You should expect the success rate for meeting your standards to be under 100%. So you need to have a healthy relationship with failure. Because failing to meet your expectations isn't the end. When you write, you can rewrite. Words are so swift and light. There's going to be more and more all the time. And failure is the path to success anyway. Trial and error is such a strong and viable strategy in the arena of writing. It is one of the fastest ways to learn, like learning to walk or ride a bike or use chopsticks. Your story isn't going to be like an exam that you can study for and prepare for. It's not something where the scope of the task is defined by a syllabus already written down somewhere that you can refer to. There is a lot that you don't know about your story, and you'll only learn these things where you're on the page with the words, actually writing, not planning or outlining. If failure is so intolerable to you, or you believe that there's a way to get everything right on the first try, or you only want to write everything once, then go get yourself like a hardcover blank page notebook and pen the words directly into that book. Because it's really true that writing is mostly rewriting. So get ready to cross and recross and cover the same ground over and over again, because that might be what it takes. The third thing you can expect is that writing your story is going to take a long time, potentially. Third thing you can expect is that writing your story is potentially going to take a really long time. However fast you think it's going to go, check yourself and understand that it might be something that'll take longer than even you can predict. You need patience. Maybe it sounds crazy if you're the type of person who doesn't have like a slow-paced hobby, like gardening, for example. But there are some things that just take as long as they're going to take, like good wine or good cheese. Time is one of the ingredients. If you're in a rush and speed is a priority to you, then you may have to choose between your time and your standards. And the last thing you can expect is to be challenged and changed as a writer and as a person. If you're not already producing writing that's good enough for your standards, then that means you have to improve. And improving is changing. Can you or anything get better if it stays the same? Learning is changing. Learning is changing the way that you think and you act. Changing what you like and what you don't like. Changing what you can accept and can't accept. Because clinging too hard to the identity of a perfectionist can set you up for problems too. If you find yourself in a position where lowering your standards seems like it could be the right move, you could find yourself feeling conflicted. So be aware and try to notice when your identity is holding you back from changing and evolving into a truer, better version of yourself as a writer. So when you incorporate these 4 expectations, as well as the 1 prerequisite, into your mindset, perfectionism stops being a roadblock and starts becoming a tool that you can make work for you. Perfectionism can be on your side. It's guiding you to the best version of your story and the best version of yourself as a writer. And by the way, if you feel like you don't have a framework or a methodology for how to write the story that you're envisioning, I've got a whole series of videos coming after this one.